Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to set up a landscape in Unreal Engine. For the textures, I'll be using the ones I created in the last two videos on my channel. The link is in the description. We'll be blending a ground and grass material, but you can add more layers using the same process depending on your project needs. This tutorial isn't fully beginner friendly, so you'll need some basic understanding of Unreal Engine. We'll be working with landscape, setting up materials using runtime virtual textures, and doing some basic asset importing. If you want to get up to speed, for landscape, check out the Royal Skies landscape videos. For the materials, you can watch the Unreal Engine materials in 6 levels of complexity video. And for the runtime virtual textures, I highly recommend the PrismaticaDev's videos on the topic. Finally, I want to mention that I mainly use Unreal for rendering and creating art rather than full game development. So this video won't focus heavily on optimization. It's simply the workflow that works for me. If you have better ideas or do things differently, feel free to share them in the comments. It helps me and everyone else who is watching. Alright, let's get started. Before we do anything, go to the project settings and enable the virtual texture support for your project in order to use the runtime virtual textures. To start with, I have a level with some basic lighting setup that comes with the blank project in the VFX preset by default. And coming to the assets that we have imported in the project, for the textures that we will be using, I have a dirt ground material as well as two different grass materials. All of these were created in InstaMAT's element graph, and there are videos on my channel that you can follow to recreate this. All of these textures will be only using the albedo, roughness and the normal maps. For the ground, we just use the base ground pattern with some stones baked in using the normal map to carry the effect. And I also have two variations for the grass base. One is just this noise with a lot of variation, and for the other one we have grass baked in, so you can use either depending on what you need. Another thing to note is that if you exported the normal map using the OpenGL format, it will not look right in Unreal as Unreal uses DirectX. You can fix this by turning on the flip green channel in the texture settings. Basically, the difference between OpenGL and DirectX is the green channel is inverted. So it depends on which format the software uses. And I exported these textures for Blender first, and Blender uses OpenGL. Just make sure to save the textures, and we can close these. With the base setup completed and the textures imported, we can work on the landscape first. This is not going to be an in-depth tutorial on how to create a landscape. If you want to know more about the tools and how it works, I would suggest you to check out the landscape tutorial series by Royal Skies, as it's a quick to the point and covers mostly everything you would need, or check out any of the other tutorials you can find on the topic. So go to the landscape mode on top. Here we can set the scale, location and resolution of the landscape. I will just lower the section size for the sake of this tutorial so that it would be easy to work with. And hit create. Now we have a landscape. We can use our sculpt tools to make it look a little interesting. I'm just using the basic sculpt brush to create some elevations. You can use shift to push it back down. We can also use other brushes like the smooth or flatten. I'm using a directional light in this scene, so we can use Ctrl L to adjust the lighting to see it a bit better. Okay, that's enough for the landscape base. You can experiment more. In order to paint our materials onto this landscape, we need to first create the material first. So let's do that and then come back to this. Before we get started with the material, again make sure to go to the project setting, search for the virtual textures, and enable virtual texture support as we will be using that. First, let's create a new folder for the material. And in that, we can create the material. Call it landscape. Let's open that up. Alright, now in the material graph, we have our base material. First, let's get a couple of nodes we will be requiring for this. Let's get a set material attribute first. Then a landscape layer blend. And finally a get material attribute. We need these nodes to blend between all of the materials. First, for the set material attribute, we will add the base color, roughness, and the normal map. If you have any other maps, you can set them here as well. The set material attribute node takes in specific texture maps like base color, normal, roughness, outputting a single combined material attribute structure that you can use further. We can duplicate it a couple of times, and we will use these to set our different materials. So get as many as you need. Next, for the layer blend, here we will blend all these different materials that we will set up with these set material attribute nodes. Let's add a few elements. I will do 4, and for each of these we can set the name for the layer. So I have 2 grass materials and 2 ground materials. We will connect each of these set material attribute nodes with the corresponding layer in the landscape layer blend. If you have more materials, you can add those. Just add more layers for them. Once this is done, we will use the Get Material attribute node. This node extracts a specific property like base color or roughness from the material attribute structure so you can use and modify it individually. Basically, what we are doing is assigning the different textures with the material attribute, combining them and blending them with the layer blend, and extracting the blended texture output maps to use with the material. So the landscape layer blend is what enables us to blend and paint different materials in the paint tab for the landscape. To get the material attributes, let's add the base color, roughness, and normal. Now with this setup, we can directly connect these to our material here, but we want to use the virtual textures. So let's add two more nodes, the runtime virtual texture output and the runtime virtual texture sample. What we are doing here is connecting our textures to the RVT output instead, and then sampling them back in and connecting these to the material output. Now the base color and roughness will work normally, but for the normal we need to do some work. First, get a transform vector. And we need to convert the normal from tangent space to world space. We also need an absolute world position. And connect the Z output to the world height. Now this should work. To connect the sample to the material output, we can connect the base color and roughness. But for the normal, again we need to convert it back from the world space to tangent space. So just duplicate the one that we have and change the source and destination from tangent to world and world to tangent spaces respectively. And we can connect the normal. Now if you look at the runtime virtual texture sample, we had to have a virtual texture here. We don't see any as we need to create one. So going back to the project, create a runtime virtual texture in your folder. Let's call it landscape RVT. You can open that to check its settings, but we don't need to change any of these right now. If we go back to our material, we have the option to choose the RVT we created. And that should do it for the base setup. Now all we need to do is connect the texture maps to each of these set material attribute nodes. Hit Ctrl space to open the content drawer. Now we can drag in all the textures we need. Let's use the ground and one of the grass textures for now. I will just lay them out. We can directly connect these, but I want some control over each of these textures, so I can control them. I can control the look using the material instance. We can directly connect these, but I want some control over each of these textures, so I can control the look using the material instance. If you are new to this, I suggest you to check out the Unreal Engine Materials and 6 Levels of Complexity tutorial by Clint, as we will be using a similar setup. Let's do the grass first. We need to set up the texture coordinates first. Since this is a landscape material, we can use a landscape coordinate node. Connect it to the UVs, and you can control the mapping values such as the scale, which we will adjust later once we can visualize the material. Let's set it to 10 for now. For the roughness, hold M and left click to get a multiply node, and hold S and left click to get a parameter. Set the default value to 1. We can connect the red channel from our texture as it is a black and white image. So we have control for the brightness of the roughness map. Next, hold E and left click to get a power node. Let's add another parameter with S. For this, we will set it to a default value of 1 as well, and connect it, and we have control over the contrast for the roughness. For organization's sake, let's assign it to a group and set the sort priorities so it will be organized well in the material instance. Next, for the normal, take a flattened normal node. Connect our normal. We'll take another scalar parameter. Set it to default 1. Before we connect this to the flattened normal, we need a 1 minus node to invert it. So hold O and left click. Now connect that to the flatness input, and that will do it for the normal. For the base color, we will do brightness, contrast, saturation, and tint controls. So for the brightness and contrast, we will have the same multiply and power setup like we did for the roughness. So simply duplicate that. For the saturation, get a desaturate node. Get a scalar parameter and set it to 1. We need to use a 1 minus to invert it. For the tint, we will simply get a multiply node with M. Now hold 3 and left click to get a constant 3 vector, and right click and convert it to a parameter. Set the default color to white. Let's take one of the material attribute nodes and connect the inputs. With all 3 textures connected to the set material attribute, we have one grass material completed. For the next one, I want to use the same roughness and normal maps. So let's connect them. For the base color, I want to use the same texture, but a slightly darker or lighter version depending on the texture. And we can control that later. So simply duplicate the setup for the color. And for this, we will increase the brightness default value to 1.2. Again, we can control all of this later in our material instance. Connect that to the second material. You can go back and adjust the names, the group, and the sort priority for better organization. That's it for the grass. I will just hit C to group all these. For the ground, it will be the same exact setup. So we can just duplicate everything. For the coordinates, we can use the same one for the grass. Or we can duplicate the landscape coordinate if we want to have a different scale for the ground and the grass. Just set all of the connection for each of the maps. Once that is done, connect them to the set material attributes. Change the names for all of the parameters and set the group and priority. That will do it for the material. We can now look to create a material instance and get our materials working for the painting on the landscape. Going back to the project, right click on the landscape material and create a material instance. You can open that and see all the parameters organized according to what we set in the material. Back in our level, we have the RVT we created earlier. We'll use this material instance on our landscape. To use the virtual texture, we need to create an RVT volume. Let's search and add that. We have the bounds for the volume, and we have to make sure that the landscape fits inside the volume. You can do it manually by adjusting the scale and location, or we can set it automatically. But before that, let's select the virtual texture we created. Now, instead of setting this manually, go down to the volume bounds and select the landscape. Hit set bounds and Unreal will automatically set the location and scale to fit the landscape we picked. Make sure you have the virtual texture selected before you do this. Going back to the landscape, we need to assign the RVT and the material. Let's hit the plus next to the draw in virtual textures. We can select the landscape RVT we made and scroll down to the landscape material and add the material instance here. Okay, with that done, we can go into the landscape mode. Don't worry if it looks like this, it's because we didn't paint any of the layers and nothing is assigned. Go to the paint tab. Here we need to create the layers. Since we have 4 in our material, we can create 4 layers. Now we need to name these. Make sure to set the same name as the ones you used in the landscape layer blend node. So this will be the name for the layer. Just set the names for each of these. Now we need to create the layer info. Hit the plus and choose a weight blended layer. You can select where to save them. I like to put it in the same folder as the material. Let's create all 4. With all the 4 layers created, we can select one and start painting on the landscape. We are able to paint, but the material is really bright. We can try the ground as well. As we can see, we are able to paint, but the colors don't look right. We need to adjust the colors, so let's open the landscape instance. Let's turn on the controls and we can play with the values. Put it to the side so we can see what is happening. I think I will lower the normal intensity for the grass. Also increase the roughness. Maybe reduce the contrast for the roughness. For now, paint the grass on the whole landscape. The material works, but it's really small and we need to adjust the tiling. So let's go to the parent material and find the landscape coordinates and increase the mapping scale value. Save it and it should update. Adjust it to a value that looks right. We can try adjusting the texture values further in the material instance. Next, let's do the ground. I'm just painting a path. The stones are really small and we need to adjust the tiling for this as well. Save that. We can increase the normal intensity for these stones. Next, adjust the color values for the ground. Now the reason we have two grass layers is so that we can paint some variation. Adjust the colors for this as well. We can make it slightly brighter than the first grass. And blend these two over the landscape. Let's do the same for the second ground layer. Now we can just paint in dark and light variation for the material wherever needed. You can soften the blending between the materials. You can take a low strength paint tool and paint that in. Let's increase the roughness of the ground. Now if you're seeing these posterized look for the color maps, it's the problem with the bit depth of the texture maps, as we are editing the color maps quite a lot with the brightness and the contrast and saturation. So you would just want a higher bit depth textures. Obviously, you can go back and add more layers for more control with the variations or to have more different materials. Also, instead of the grass base we used, you can use the one with the grass blaze baked in. So I'm just going to quickly replace the textures. You can also convert the texture sample maps to parameters if you like, so you can change them in the material instance. I'm connecting the UVs from the landscape coordinates. And we'll just replace the texture maps. Once we hit save, it should update the textures. And there you have the grass texture with the grass blades baked in. Here we can replace the texture maps, but you can also create more layers and duplicate the setup, and then you can choose where to paint the different grass materials. That's it for setting up the material. You can play with the landscape sculpting and create large landscapes for your scene or levels. We have some stretch, so we can smooth that out. Yeah, so that's how you create this. It's a fairly simple process. We are just using runtime virtual textures and the material with layer blend. Also, if we go back to selection, it's important to have the landscape inside the bounds of the RVT volume. If not, you will have such stretching and clipping. Runtime virtual textures are great for large landscape, and you can do a lot of interesting things with it later, like blend other objects with the landscape. You can now paint your foliage and add other assets on top of this. With the landscape complete, I wanted to talk clearly about virtual textures and why we are using them. Virtual textures are really good if you are working on large landscapes, as they contribute to improving performance. But for everything we did so far, you didn't really need to implement anything with virtual textures. And if you're simply creating the environment for animation, renders, or visualization, performance is not really an issue. So technically, if we open the landscape material, We can directly connect the texture maps to the material output without creating the output and the sampling in the virtual texture. And everything should still work just fine. You can pretty much skip setting up everything related to virtual textures and you'll save time and make the scene simpler. So it is up to you to research and figure out whether you require the use of virtual textures in your project. Apart from optimization, there are other benefits to using virtual textures. The main reason I'm using them in this project is to blend rocks and other terrain objects into the ground. So let's quickly look at a simple example on how to do that. I won't be getting into too much detail about this topic, but you can get an idea on how to implement this. So I have this rock asset here with a basic material setup with the color, roughness and the normal maps. It is similar to the landscape material, and I just have the texture coordinates instead of the landscape coordinates as this is a individual object. I also have all the parameters labeled and organized properly so they work in the material instance. Opening up the material instance, I just adjusted the color and roughness values. I have that applied to the rock. Now, if I place the rock over the landscape in such a way that the mesh is intersecting with the ground, you can see the hard line where they meet. We can fix this by simply using virtual textures and some node magic. First, let's create a new runtime virtual texture. Call it blend RVT as we will be using it to blend the ground with the assets. Open it up. For this, change the virtual texture content to world height. So we are only capturing the world height in this. Next, we need another volume for this. So let's duplicate the one we had earlier with Ctrl D. All we need to do is select the blend RVT for this. Now we also need the landscape to affect the virtual texture. So let's add another element in the draw virtual texture and select the blend RVT here as well. With the virtual texture setup, all we need to do is go to the node graph and get the blend working. Open up the rock material. Add a runtime virtual texture sample. And select the blend RVT. Since we have the world height, we can use that. Take an absolute world position node. Subtract the Z value with the world height. Next, use a divide and we will divide this with a value. This value is basically going to control how smooth the blending will be. Higher the value, softer the blending. So let's take a value of 100 for now. Next, take a saturate node. Then a 1 minus node. Let's connect this to the base color and see what we get. As you can see, we have the black and white map that we can use as a mask for the blending. Now that we have a mask, we can add another runtime virtual texture sample. This time we will choose the landscape RVT so that we can sample the texture maps from the landscape and blend them with the rock textures. We need the transform vector to convert the normal map from the world space to tangent space. With all this done, we just need to blend the texture maps. Take 3 lerp nodes with L and left click for the color, normal and roughness. Connect the rock textures to the A input of the lerp nodes. And the landscape textures from the RVT sample of the landscape to the B inputs of the lerp. For the alpha, we can use the mask we created. Basically, we have the rocks as the base and the parts where it is white in the mask, we are displaying the landscape textures. Since we are using the 1- node, or the mask texture would be inverted, which is not a big deal, but you have to rearrange the order of the connections and it's just cleaner this way. To finish this, we can connect the lerps to the final output. Just make sure you are connecting the correct maps. If we go back to the 3D viewport, we can see the rock now blends well with the landscape. You can go back and increase the divide value to a higher number to make it even softer. Obviously, you can also add a scalar input to control it in the material instance if you want. This works great, not just for rocks, but if you want to scatter some other stuff on the ground, or for something like trees. You can even use this with things like fences to make it look like they are planted in the ground. And there are many other things that you can use this with. Alright, that's all for this tutorial. I know this is quite long, but I had to cover quite a few things. Again, I suggest you look at other tutorials regarding landscape, materials and RVTs, as there are some really good videos on those topics that can explain a lot more in detail than what I covered. And if you found this video helpful, thank you for watching.